Good morning. My name is STENY. I am the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, the Democratic Leader in the House of Representatives. We have been out of Congress for just a few days on a summer recess. During that period of time, we have confronted great tragedy. Sadly, continuing tragedy. How many Americans will lose their lives or their loved ones to rampant gun violence before the United States Senate takes action? So far this year, more than 9,000 Americans, that's in 7 months, have been killed by gun violence, including those killed in more than 250 mass shootings this year in America. The attacks in El Paso, in Dayton, in Gilroy, California, and the violence, all within about 7 days of one another, more than the neighborhood of 50 Americans lost their lives to gun violence. Some 5 months ago, on February 27th, 2019, the House of Representatives passed a bill, H.R. 8, a bill that is supported by over 95% of Americans. Passed the House of Representatives and sent to the United States Senate, where, sadly, it languishes. Is it the solution to all this violence? It is not. But 95% of Americans support it because they believe it is a significant and important step to take in the face of this violence. The House has acted, and it is time, past time, for the House to act. We had a sit-in some 2 years ago, actually 3, on June 22nd, 2016. Since that time, we believe there are in the neighborhood of some 25,000 plus lives that have been lost. I'm now going to introduce a young woman whose school was subjected to gun violence. And as a result, a young student, her friend, lost their lives, her life. Jaylyn Willie, who died on March 20th, 2018. Jackson O'Mara, one of her classmates, is one of those who thought silence and inaction was not enough. Jackson?
Good morning. My name is Jackson O'Mara. I'm 18, and I'm the State Director for March for Our Lives of Maryland. I recently graduated from Great Mills High School in Southern Maryland. If you recognize the name of my school, it's because on March 20th, 2018, 16-year-old Jaylyn Willie was shot and killed. And our entire community was traumatized. I'm here today to represent the young people all across America who've had their lives ripped apart by gun violence. I'm here today to represent the young people who want a change. And I'm here today to tell Senator McConnell that it's time to take immediate action on gun violence. We need a clean version of S-42. We need a grant system for states to adopt ERPO laws, and we need funding for the CDC and NIH to do their jobs and research gun violence. At this point, there are two options. Either the Senate votes on and passes this life-saving legislation immediately, or we vote out those who stand in our way. Gun violence is a national crisis, and the Senate needs to start acting like it. Thank you.
Thanks you, Jackson, who is a leader in March for Our Lives. And I now want to introduce Congressman Donald PAYNE of New Jersey. Congressman PAYNE.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer, and thank you for your leadership in bringing us here today. Good morning. As a congressman from Newark, New Jersey, I come from a town that continues to suffer from this national plague of gun violence. I want to publicly offer my full support of the Bipartisan Background Check Act of 2019. This act will make sure that people who buy guns are law-abiding and loyal citizens, that gun owners are people who want to defend their families, not attack our citizens. It's a statement that me and my colleagues in the Congress will not sit back and allow another El Paso, Dayton, or any more shootings to happen without action. Yet, we mourn those lost in these all too frequent disasters. It's important to remember that while some cities suffer these tragedies occasionally, others suffer them daily. Like me, many members return to districts where gun violence is all too common, where it is the rare exemption to find a family that hasn't been a victim of this national menace. That's why I support this act so strongly. And we need to know who's buying guns and why. We need to make sure that our sportsmen are getting the opportunity to use guns in a proper manner and not some psychopath. And we need to show the country that our tolerance of gun violence is over. And now I'd like to introduce a young man who has suffered this tragedy, but fortunately is here to speak on his own. Gregory Jackson.
Good afternoon. I'm Gregory Jackson with the Community Justice Action Fund, but also a survivor of gun violence. And first of all, I want to thank the House of Representatives for making such a strong stride forward to reduce violence. As hopefully many of you know, hundreds of thousands of people survive an act of gun violence every year. And while we may think that's a small thing, that they're still here and they're still standing strong, what we don't see is the hours of therapy they go through, the months of trauma, the tears in their families' eyes, and just frankly the years, maybe even a lifetime of emotional trauma after going through an act of violence. I grew up in rural Virginia where guns were seen for ways to hunt and maybe protect yourself, but in 2013, I was struck down by a stray bullet when someone literally tried to take my life. And after 21 days in the hospital, 6 months of recovery, I was able to get back on my feet, but I'm still emotionally dealing with that every day. And I've spoken to hundreds of survivors who are going through the same thing every single day and really waiting for Congress to step up and do something. In our cities, every day we are losing folks. In DC, we lost a 10-year-old that was walking across the street to get ice cream to gun violence. A 12-year-old was shot down at a McDonald's after a few weeks after hosting his own gun violence prevention rally. And this is an epidemic that is hitting people in our communities every single day. So I beg of the Senate to step up and do something, to step up and push H.R. 8 and pass H.R. 8, and also continue to strive forward to pass legislation that will prevent gun violence that's traumatizing so many lives every day. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Now I want to introduce Dr. He's going to introduce the doctor, Congressman Don BEYER of Virginia. Congressman?
Thank you, Leader Hoyer. The issue that brings us here today is deadly serious. If this is a typical day in the United States, there will be at least one mass shooting. They don't all make the national headlines like El Paso or Daytona, but they claim a huge toll in American life. And Mitch McConnell isn't doing anything about it. And this isn't because he doesn't know what the problem is or how to solve it. We know exactly why he isn't here. He's waiting for the outrage to die down, for the headlines to change, for the people to turn the page and think about something else. But as he delays and waits for people to lose interest, 100 Americans are dying every day from gun violence. In another hot Washington, D.C. 46 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told the crowd which had assembled in front of the Lincoln Memorial, "We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real promises of democracy. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment." The House has done its job to save these lives, and now Mitch McConnell needs to do his. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joe Saccharin. He's an assistant professor of surgery, director of emergency general surgery, and associate chief of the Division of Acute Care Surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Once a victim of gun violence, Dr. Saccharin spends much of his time as a clinician, researcher, and advocate with the primary goal of reducing gun violence in America. He sees the wounds these bullets make every single day, and he founded This Is Our Lane to bring together healthcare providers to advocate for solutions to gun violence. He also serves on the board of directors of the Brady Campaign. Dr. Saccharin.
Well, good morning. First let me thank the majority leader for his leadership and the rest of the team for being here today. I stand before you not just as a survivor of gun violence or a Brady board member, but as a trauma surgeon, as one of many healthcare professionals that are front and center of taking care of these patients day in and day out. And make no mistake about this, over the next decade, over 1 million Americans will be shot. And that doesn't even begin to tell the impact that that has on society. The mothers, fathers, sisters and brothers that are devastated after these senseless injuries. And if we're being honest, the mainstream media covers this issue around mass shootings. But there are young men from Black and brown communities that are injured and killed in cities like Baltimore, Chicago, Philadelphia. And those stories often go untold. Look, this is a complex health problem. As the congressman said, there is no one solution. It's a multifaceted approach. The House has done their job. They passed H.R. 8. And now we are calling on Senator Mitch McConnell to take action, not sides. It's about time that we start approaching this issue as a uniquely American problem, because that's what it is. This is not a Republican problem. It's not a Democratic problem. It's an American problem. Is it going to solve everything? No. But it's a step in the right direction, and it is critical. Since the Brady bill has been passed, over 3.5 million firearms have been kept out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them, like felons, domestic abusers, and those that are a danger to themselves or others. So we're calling on the Senate to have the moral courage to do the right thing, because Americans are not going to stand on the sidelines of history as people continue to be injured and killed. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. At this time, I want to introduce the gentlewoman from Michigan, who probably has been involved with this issue perhaps longer than any of us. She and her husband have been outspoken advocates, and I appreciate her coming from Michigan to introduce one of our speakers and to give her testimony as well, and urging for Mr. McConnell to act. Debbie Dingle, Michigan.
Thank you, Steny Hoyer, for your leadership and for holding this today. 10 days ago, the weekend that is the most recent episode. We've now seen 253 mass shootings. It was Dearborn Homecoming in the city that I live in, a 3-day festival. Friday night, before the shootings, I served beer in the beer tent all 3 nights. People know where to find me. A mother came and grabbed my hand and would not let it go and said to me, "My daughter is starting kindergarten this fall. She's 5 years old. I have to decide about whether I buy her the backpack that she wants or a bulletproof backpack." Her daughter is on the autistic scale, and she said to me, "She'll never stay quiet in a closet. I'm scared to death. You have to do something. You have to do something." On Sunday, after the shootings, I was in the Access Tent, which is an Arab American organization in my hometown. And little kids, they know me as Miss Debbie, said to me, "Why do people hate us? Are we safe?" Our children are going back to school in a couple of weeks, some before Labor Day, some after Labor Day. I shouldn't be answering questions of mothers, of kindergartners, or the children themselves about whether they're safe or they're hated. We got to stop this partisan bickering. I spent my marriage married to John Dingell. And look, I can't hide from it. The New York Times told you he was one of the founders of the NRA in the 60s and a board member. But before he died, when I'd spoken out again, he said, "Deborah, I'm proud of you. Times have changed. We have to do something. We can't keep going to our corners and not figuring out what we're going to do." At the top 25 industrialized nations, 93% of the children between 0 and 14 that are killed by guns are American children. It's wrong. The Senate's got to come to the table. They've got to act. We've got to start to do something so our kids can start school and not look at me and say, "Are we safe? Why do people hate me?" And now I am proud to introduce Christian Hain, who's the Vice President of Policy at Brady, who also comes to this issue because of his own family. His parents were shot, his mother killed. Christian, thank you for being here.
My name is Christian Heine. I'm the Vice President of Policy at Brady. My parents were coming home in 2005 from a holiday vacation. They spent the weekend getting sunburnt on a boat. When they came back, we experienced what far too many Americans experience every day. My dad was shot 3 times and survived his wounds. My mom was shot and killed with a single bullet to the back. Neighbors there that day said that she had begged for her life, was able to get up and run, made it about 10 steps before that bullet shot and killed her, and she died before she hit the ground. We'll never know if that's true. It's a nice sentiment. Gun violence isn't abstract to any of us. It's very real. Gun violence isn't just a statistic, isn't just a number on a sheet of paper. When we read about the 100 people who die every day at the hands of guns, it's very real to us because it's the life we live. Our lives will never be the same. The people up here, gun violence to me isn't just those stats and figures, it's the fact that I won't be able to call my mother at the end of this day. It's the fact that my mom will never know the joy of being a grandmother. She'll never have the opportunity to hold one of her grandchildren. Gun violence to me is the fact that on my wedding day, not only is my wife never going to have the opportunity to know the most wonderful woman in my life, aside from her, it's that there was an empty chair that I had to stare at as my wife walked down the aisle. This is not abstract. This is not a conversation that's too soon or too early. It is way too late. The fact is, we don't need action once recess is back. We don't need action 2 years from now. We don't need action in 2020 when we have potentially a new president or a new Congress. We need action right now. Mitch McConnell has bills on his desk right now, and every day that those bills are not signed into law, more people will experience what we live through every single day. The cost of this inaction, the cost of Mitch McConnell not bringing these bills forward, let's be clear, it's human lives. It's more children that will not be able to call their mother when they go home. It's more parents who won't be able to hold their children at night when they come home. The time is now, and we have to act. And I'm so thankful to have a House that is willing to take these steps. We need the Senate to follow suit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Anthony Brown from Maryland, who himself is a retired colonel, knows a lot about guns, and knows a lot about safety. Congressman Anthony Brown.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Leader Hoyer for convening this conference and your leadership over the decades in our efforts to reduce gun violence across this country. I also want to thank my colleagues who've been long after this effort and have worked diligently day in and day out in their communities and in Congress as we struggle with this effort to reduce gun violence in our communities. And I also want to thank the survivors, the family members, the victims who are here today sharing your tragedy, your trauma, and putting a face on the impact that gun violence has on the families, the communities, and us as a nation. So I thank you for being here today. Our gun violence problem, as we all know, is an epidemic. More than 250 mass shootings this year alone, and more than several tens of thousands. You hear the numbers, they range, 36,000 people shot and killed on average every year in this country. And in the face of this epidemic, Mitch McConnell is doing nothing. He won't even bring up bipartisan solution that we have passed in this House over 165 days ago. It's now the time for Mitch McConnell and President Trump to do something meaningful about gun violence in the United States. And meaningful action doesn't end with signing a bipartisan background checks bill, which is important. We must pursue a federal red flag law, similar to what we've done in Maryland, which is empowering law enforcement to remove weapons from those who pose an imminent threat to themselves and others. We have to ban high-capacity magazines that allow the Dayton shooter and so many others to fire off tens of rounds in merely seconds. We have to ban assault weapons to get these weapons of war off our streets. You know, I was asked recently, someone said to me, Congressman Brown, why do you have a bill in? I support banning assault weapons entirely. But I also have a bill in to raise the age to 21. I didn't come up with this idea. The day after the Parkland shooting, mass shooting, President Trump said, let's raise the age to 21, which is what the age is to buy a handgun from a federally registered dealer. But someone asked me, say, well, why should we raise the age for an assault weapon to 21 when we can let 18-year-olds fire an M4, an M16, an M60 machine gun, and even drive a tank in the United States military? There's a real difference. In the military, we put weapons of war in the hands of everyone from age 18 to 60 because they've got an important job to do. They have a job to go to war, win the war, come home to their families and their country. But the important thing, to come home to a country that is safe and secure. And we make this nation safe and secure when we take weapons out of the hands, particularly weapons of war, out of the hands of people who have no business having those weapons. In the military, we train, we supervise. There's a real purpose. There's no purpose of having an AR-15 semi-automatic weapon with 100-round capacity magazines? There's no purpose. There's a clear distinction in my mind, but more importantly, there's a clear distinction in the minds of the overwhelming majority of America. We in the House, my colleagues and I, we have done some important work. We've sent one bill, H.R. 8, over to the Senate. There's a lot more that we could send, but we said, let's act on this one, where there's almost universal consensus that this is an important step to make. So as we stand here today in a call for more efforts, whether it's improving mental health and mental health services, addressing assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, let's start with passing universal background check, which has bipartisan support in the House and almost universal support among the American public. It is a real privilege for me to be here this morning with my colleagues, as I mentioned, but also to introduce Dr. Wendy Edmonds. Dr. Edmonds, who is my constituent, her sister, Sylvia Frazier, was one of 12 people murdered on September 16th, 2013, at the Washington Navy Yard. Sylvia worked at Naval Sea Systems Command as an information assurance manager since 2000, a patriotic American dedicated to our country. She should be alive today with her family and serving her country, and she's not. Dr. Edmonds.
I watched my sister Sylvia Renee Frazier move about the church gracefully as she put on a great, memorable dance performance. When the program was over, she said, "I'm exhausted." I hugged her neck, kissed her on the cheek, and I said, "Go on home, get some rest." Monday morning, September 16, 2013, I woke up, carried on with my usual routine, preparing for work. It was a beautiful, sunny day. Suddenly, my phone started ringing consecutively, and I found myself on conference calls with my sisters and my brother, talking about breaking news. There's been a shooting at the Washington Navy Yard. That was Sylvia's, where she worked. Building 97. That was her building. We desperately tried to call her over and over and over again, and by 1 o'clock we knew we had to go home to Glenarden and tell my mom and dad what was going on. We prayed, we hoped, we did everything that we knew to do in that kind of a situation. And sometime around 9:30 that evening, my brother came home, and he and my sister Lindley were at the Nat Stadium, where people were being reunited with their families. And he said, "Sylvia was shot. She did not survive her injuries. And she's home with the Lord now." Those words changed our lives forever. In my life and my family, we suffer permanent, sudden, brutal disconnection from Sylvia. As for me, for weeks after that, I could look in the mirror and I could see my body and I couldn't feel it. It took everything out of me to understand that my sister Sylvia and her 11 coworkers, they didn't stand a chance. They didn't stand a chance because Sylvia was gunned down by a man who was carrying a Remington 870 Express, 7-round, 12-gauge shotgun that he acquired just days before. Every time I turn on the news and I hear about a mass shooting, a shooting in general, I cry. I cry because I know the pain, and that pain never goes away. It's the pain that doesn't go away, and that's why I support the gun prevention measures, just common sense gun prevention measures. Now you heard about Sylvia, and you know part of our story, but I am incensed. And so, at what point are you outraged, Senate Leader McConnell? When will you be moved beyond following such a toxic decision to remain silent on legislation passed by the House in February? When will you invigorate a courageous move and bring H.R. 8 to the floor. When is that going to take place? We must stand in the gap for those who have gone on before us and for those who are here now, because unfortunately, we're all subject to mass shootings. To Senate Leader McConnell, you're overdue. It's time to lead the Senate to pass H.R. 8. Thank you.
I want to thank all the speakers. I also want to thank my colleague, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Elliot Engel, who does not have somebody to introduce but represents millions of people subject to gun violence and carnage on a daily basis. The statistics are stark. The statistics are daily occurrences. You said summons the courage. I've been in politics for a long time. It takes no courage to put on the Senate floor a bill that is supported by 90+% of Americans. What takes courage is to look a special interest group in the eye and say, enough is enough. It is time to act. One of the great poets of our time, Bob Dylan, wrote a poem. It was called Blowin' in the Wind, sung by Peter, Paul, and Mary, who sang at that March on Washington in 1963. I want to read you 6 lines from that poem. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just didn't see? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The song says, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. But let me say, the answer, my fellow citizens, is in the House of Representatives, and we have acted. The answer, my fellow citizens, is in the United States Senate, and the courage to summon up, Senator McConnell, the willingness to put one small answer on the floor. As been observed, more needs to be done. But this is a start, a consensus start, a start that the overwhelming number of Americans support. In just a few minutes, the United States Senate will have what we call a pro forma session. That is not a session to act. The time is not to simply have silence. The time is not simply for reflection. The time is not for a moment of silence. The time for the Senate is to act. The time for the Senate and the House and the White House to act. The time is to listen to the American people. I rode home from Israel on a plane late Sunday night into Monday. And the pilot of that plane came back to my seat and said, you know, I don't know much about politics. I don't get very involved in politics. He said, but something needs to be done. Action needs to be taken for those children of which Debbie Dingell spoke, of that mom, that sister who lost their lives. The time, Senator McConnell, is to act. Bring H.R. 8 to the floor now The overwhelming majority of our fellow citizens believe that is a step to make their children, their husbands, their wives, their sisters, their brothers, their neighbors, their fellow Americans a little safer. That's why we come here today. And that's what we'll be demanding tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. The House Judiciary Committee will be coming back, and they're going to address this issue. We have acted, they have acted, and we passed a bill which Americans believe is one part of the answer. We are here to urge Senator McConnell to bring that bill to the floor and urge every senator to listen to those 95% of Americans who say everybody ought to be checked. No loopholes. Let's catch every terrorist who wants to buy a gun. Let's catch every criminal who wants to buy a gun. Let's catch everybody who's had a mental health problem that wants to buy a gun. No loopholes. Everybody. Why? Because that makes common sense. That's what H.R. 8 is. And the American people know it is common sense. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
How concerned, Mr. Barr touched on this, how concerned are you that each day that passes, the public momentum or urgency may wane, and by the end of recess, nothing actually gets done?
Let me tell you that all of us standing here have been urging this for a long time. As I mentioned, 3 years ago, we saw over 50 Americans lose their lives at a nightclub, having fun. And we urged the House to act and the Senate to act, both controlled by the other party. No action was taken. We were in charge for about a little over 30 days when we passed H.R. 8. It's a time for action. And the American people, that pilot that I talked to who came up to me, knew who I was and came up to me on the plane and said, Congressman, when are we going to do something? I don't know what the answer is. I don't think there is an answer. But not to act is irresponsible. I hope the American public every day, and somebody mentioned it, when one person loses their life, it doesn't really get a lot of coverage. If we had a moment of silence for every American that lost their lives, we wouldn't be able to do anything else. So we need to act. We won't act perfectly. We won't act in a way that stops all of this from happening. But not to act is a refusal to meet our responsibilities to the American people.
Congressman, how do you explain to the public that right now one senator, Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, has the power to bring this type of legislation to a vote in the Senate? And what do you tell him?
I think the person that needs to explain that is Senator McConnell. And I think the American people need to be outraged by that refusal to bring a bill supported by over 90% of the American people to the floor for consideration. He doesn't have to vote for it. Every senator will have to make their own decision. But not to bring it to the floor is an abdication of his responsibility to the American people. I'll take two.
If you can't see this bill voted on the Senate floor, or something else significant that Democrats believe has to happen, will you look to the CR or in the appropriations process to put some kind of a rider?
The answer to your question is we will take every opportunity we can to ensure that at least this step and more are taken. We can do what we can do. We cannot force Senator McConnell to do something. But the other 99 United States senators can force him to do something, and I would urge them to do so.
Would that violate that deal you have on the poison pills, on the budget agreement?
we don't necessarily have to take that on an appropriation bill. That poison pill was as to that process and the appropriations process alone. So there are many other ways we can act, and we should.
Mr. Hoyer, another development has happened over the recess, and that now a majority of your caucus supports moving forward with an impeachment inquiry.
This is not about impeachment.
But Jerry Nadler said last week that the House is now currently in formal impeachment proceedings. Do you agree with that?
But look, this is. I want to stay focused. I want to stay focused.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I want to tell people who really, there is grassroots support across this country. This Sunday, in every state across the country, Mom Demands Action, the Brady Group, other guns will hold a rally in every single state. So those that care, those that want people to hear that they give a damn, excuse my language, get out there, show them, tell their senators it's time to act. Let's show that grassroots movement from one coast to the other coast and in the heart of the Midwest.
And let's stay focused.
Stay focused, too.
Thank you very much.
What bill is judiciary going to mark up?
They're going to meet and discuss a number of those bills, some of which deal with assault weapons, red flag laws, some deal with magazine capacities. There are a lot of bills involved, and I'm sure they're going to look at all of those and see what opportunities we have.
Legislation, if the Senate were to pass the incremental amendment law, not HR 8, would you put that on the floor?
HR 8 should be passed, and certainly we're going to consider any bills as eligible for the floor that the Judiciary Committee considers and passes out. But we want to focus. It is incomprehensible that the United States Senate would refuse to consider legislation which says that terrorists can't get guns, or criminals can't get guns, or domestic abusers can't get guns. Incomprehensible. That's the first litmus test of whether we can take any common sense action to try to stop this carnage. Thank you.
What did he say?